So in my book, Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture, I discuss a number of these domain models and classifications. However, the capability alone does not mean all that much.
Some teams get a very focused vision where they invest heavily in one domain only and neglect the others.
And I think in practice, organizations often still view architecture or enterprise architecture as part of the IT domain.
I think it's all about alignment across all the moving parts between the full architecture domain.
So you could say that business architecture is essentially the business lens of enterprise architecture.
This will frame EA as a business-led discipline. What happens when a company invests millions into technology, yet business results never follow? The problem often is not the tools, it's the misalignment between the strategy and technology investments. In this episode of the EA Explained video series, we unpack the 4 core domains of enterprise architecture: business, information, application, and technology. And we will discuss how each domain plays a distinct role, why they must work together as a one coherent system. Also, what are the risks of over-investing in just one domain over the others, and when it makes sense to expand from a 4-domain model to 5-domain model. By the end of this episode, you will see how these domains bridge strategy to execution, and why tailoring them rather than following a rigid model is the real key to success. Welcome to EA Explained. Hello and welcome back to a new episode from the EA Explained series with Eric Jager. Welcome again, Eric.
Yes, thank you, Omar. Thanks again for having me. It's still a pleasure to do these sessions with you.
It's always my pleasure, Eric. Well, so far we have explored several topics that introduce EA, where we started the story from where enterprise architecture came from, why it matters, and what it really means. But now it's time to start breaking it down. In this episode, we are going to explore the full architecture domains, which are the major building blocks that make up a typical enterprise architecture structure. These domains provide mainly the needed structure and help connect business strategy to the technology execution, as we discussed in the previous episodes. Eric, I know that we have a heavy topic today because this is where EA becomes real. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely. It will be a heavy topic, but also an interesting topic. And I think it's a good idea to give the viewers or the listeners a little bit of deep dive, like we mentioned.
Absolutely. Then let's jump into today's episode directly and explore how these domains come together. Let's have an overview of the EE domains and layers. So let's start with a clear view, Eric. Can you walk us through the core domains of enterprise architecture and what role each one plays in the overall structure?
Yes, well, at least I can try, of course. I think that the classification and the number of architecture domains actually slightly varies depending on the architecture method or approach you're using. And the most common models distinguish 3 domains: business, information systems, and technology. And the information systems architecture domain is then often divided into 2 separate parts, one for data and one for applications. And therefore, I think you could also refer to it as a 4-domain model consisting of business, data, application, and technology. So the TOGAF standard, for example, uses this 3-domain model, which we can see here on the first slide. And the information systems domain is divided into the data and application architectures, like I just mentioned. Now, in my book, I discuss a number of these domain models and their classifications. Personally, I prefer this 4-layer model consisting of business, information, application, and technology domains. And that is why I believe that information is more comprehensive than data, which is why I actually prefer this model. And to give you an example, if I tell you the numbers 21, 22, 23, 24, and even 25, they probably don't mean that much to you at first. Now, these are raw data. However, if I add that these are the temperature forecasts for next week, this data suddenly becomes meaningful. It becomes information. So I think that information is a more valuable asset to an organization than data alone. And that is why I'm in favor of this 4-domain model that includes information architecture. Now, as for what role each domain plays, I think the names of the domains reveal these roles. So for example, the business domain focuses on entities related to business operations. You can think of capabilities, business processes, actors, and the information systems domain then encompasses data and application architecture, like I said before, focusing on entities such as information concepts. Now, these information concepts are actually intangible items that are of significant importance to an organization, such as strategy or customer or order. And in addition to information concepts, there are the data entities such as data sets and database tables. And then the application domain contains applications and functionalities. And the last domain in the row, technology domain or technology architecture, contains entities such as network, infrastructure, and hardware.
Yeah, this gives a full landscape about AA domains, I would say, Eric. But the question is, how do these domains interrelate together? Or in other words, is it important to see these domains as part of a coherent system that you discussed before, or they can be isolated components?
I think the domains that I just mentioned, they consist of entities, right? Or concepts that are used in an organization. And the relationship between these entities are important because entities alone are not all that meaningful. They only become meaningful when they are linked to other entities or when their purpose or meaning for an organization becomes clear. And this is why relationships between entities and between different entities from different domains are needed. So for example, consider a capability. Now, this is an entity from the business domain, and it indicates what an organization should be able to do in relation to its business operations and strategy. It describes an organization's ability to do something. However, a capability alone does not mean all that much. It becomes meaningful when it's related to, let's say, a business process, because then it becomes clear which processes are actually carried out in the organization, whether automated by applications or performed manually. And another example is the information concept. Now, as I mentioned, these concepts are important for an organization, but they truly become meaningful when they are linked to the application systems they're used in or the actors that actually use them. Now, all of these entities are usually recorded in a metamodel. And this metamodel consists of all the entities that occur in an organization, including the relationships between them. So it maps relationships within and across domains, giving meaning to the entities.
Yeah, 100%. And sometimes as well, from where I have seen before with teams, some teams get a very focused vision where they invest heavily in one domain only and neglect the others. And the most common domain teams invest in is technology part, as you mentioned. Have you encountered organizations that mostly focus on one domain over other, like the technology, for example, or the application, and at expense of the others? What are the consequences of this approach or this vision, I would say?
Well, that's actually a good question. And I'm sorry to say, but the answer is yes. I did come across organizations that focus only on one domain, and indeed it was technology. And I think in practice, organizations often still view architecture or enterprise architecture as part of the IT domain. Now, this suggests that these organizations believe that architecture is actually solely a technical field limited to technology architecture. Now, as we discussed earlier, technology architecture is only one of the 3 or 4 domains. And if an organization limits itself exclusively to just the technology domain, then only a very small part of enterprise architecture is actually implemented. And this renders architecture in an organization reactive rather than proactive. And I think without input on what is happening in the business domain, architecture can only respond to what comes from that domain. And this results in a reactive approach and a kind of lack of synergy between the domains. So in this way, architecture will always lag behind. And I think this is why it's important to create a metamodel, like I mentioned, because it demonstrates that much more is going on in an organization than just the technical aspect. And that all of these elements are actually interconnected. So if one moves, the others move too. Now, I lecture at the Eindhoven University of Technology on applying architecture to healthcare. And I often show this slide in my presentation. Now, for the sake of readability, I left out the relationships between the entities that we can see in the metamodel here. This metamodel depicts the one that is commonly used by the industry, and it highlights which part of the architecture receive attention. Now, typically, this attention is limited to IT or technology architecture, and the other entities in the model receive no attention whatsoever. Now, as a result, an organization has absolutely no control over its operations, creating the reactive situation that I mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. I can't agree more, Eric. I think it's all about alignment across all the moving parts between the full architecture domains. And that starts by understanding the full domains as a whole system, I would say. Each one is integrated to the other domain and how they are connected all together. I would like to take this one step further and explore each of these domains more deeply, because each one of them or each domain come with their own challenges, tools, even stakeholders and different roles. So would you like to begin with the one of the top of the stack, which is the business architecture, and discuss what are the core focus and contribution to enterprise architecture?
Well, I think business architecture is how shall I put it, the bridge between strategy and execution within an organization. And I think its core focus is to define how the business works. So it models capabilities, value streams, information, organizational structures, just to describe how the business delivers value. And it aligns this strategy to operations by ensuring that the strategic goals are actually translated into actionable changes across processes, people, technology. And it also provides a shared business view. And with that, I mean that it creates this common language or blueprint that stakeholders like business leaders, IT people, operations, etc., they can use to make decisions. Now, the key entities, and I'm referring back to the metamodel that I've shown you some time before, are business capabilities. So what the business does independent of who or how it does it. Value streams, how value is delivered to stakeholders, information concepts, organization mapping, etc. All key entities of the business architecture domain. Now, enterprise architecture is this holistic framework that aligns business data, applications, and technology, whereas business architecture contributes by being the anchor and starting point of it all. So it's the strategy execution link, as it provides this structured way to translate business strategy into the required changes in processes, systems, and technology. And I think it also helps to identify which capabilities need to be improved to, for example, guide investment decisions. And of course, it provides context for other domains as well. So it guides information architecture, it shapes application architecture, which systems support which capabilities, and it actually influences technology architecture. For instance, what platforms and infrastructure are needed. Now, business architecture focuses on what the business does and how it delivers its value, while enterprise architecture actually takes that foundation and ensures that technology, data, and processes are all aligned with it. So you could say that business architecture is essentially the business lens of enterprise architecture.
That's awesome, Eric, because I think this will frame EA as a business-led discipline, not a technology discipline or technology-led discipline like some practitioners or some people say. But with regards to business architecture in specific, some people and some practitioners are saying that business architecture is a more standalone practice that can support the EA, sure, but it is not the driving part or the driving domain in the enterprise architecture. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that's actually a sharp observation you just put out there. And this actually gets at one of the active debates in the architecture community. Now, let me try to frame this and then give you my take. I think there are multiple perspectives. I'll give you both and we'll take it from there. So I think there is this more traditional view of business architecture that puts it as being part of enterprise architecture. So if you look at frameworks like the TOGAF standard, then business architecture is considered to be one of the 3 or 4 core domains, like I mentioned at the start of this session, like business, data, application, technology. But if enterprise architecture is about aligning business and IT, then you need business architecture as the anchor domain, right? And this will keep everything integrated and ensures that business changes are always linked to IT and data impact. However, in this view, business architecture actually gets kind of like reduced to being the first step before IT design of something, which actually weakens its independent and a strategic role. Now, there is also this more emerging view that distinguishes business architecture as a standalone discipline. For example, practitioners in groups like the Business Architecture Guild, they argue that business architecture is a discipline in its own right. And this is mainly due to its scope, strategy, translation, capability mapping, value delivery, goal alignment. And I think from this angle, enterprise architecture can leverage business architecture, but doesn't own it. Instead, I think enterprise architecture consumes the outputs as inputs for IT, data, or technology planning. And this gives business architecture credibility outside of IT, making it actually a tool for executives and strategists as much as for architects. But mind you, though, that without a tight integration, the handoff to enterprise architecture domains to the other domains can be a bit fragmented. So I think I see it as a both and situation, not an either or. So I think as a practice, architecture is standalone. It is about business first, not IT. It belongs with the strategy and operations side of the organization as much as with enterprise architecture. And it's not or, and as a contribution. I think business architecture is foundational to enterprise architecture. So EA needs it to stay business driven rather than technology driven. So maybe think of it this way, that business architecture is kind of like the lens. It shows what matters most to the business and how value flows. And enterprise architecture is the full body of glasses. So it combines business, data, application, technology, all these lenses so that the enterprise can actually see clearly. Now, if an organization struggles with IT-centric or technology-focused enterprise architecture, then elevating business architecture as a separate but tightly connected practice can actually help. So if the enterprise architecture is already mature and business aligned, then business architecture can remain embedded as the business domain of enterprise architecture.
Well, that's a very interesting perspective, Eric. But I would like to add something on this particular part. Some people, when you mention that I'm a business architect within the enterprise architecture practice, let's have this, I would say, example. Some people tweak the business architecture components that you already mentioned, that it is a business driven, talks about the business, what the business is doing, and so on and so forth, to having this business driven into a digital or an IT aspect. So for example, when you define capabilities, it is not from a business perspective capabilities, it is from a digital perspective to comply with the full enterprise architecture that is technology driven more into business driven. So this is the issue that I always see on the ground, that most of the people, they don't have a business driven EA that like you mentioned right now, and they believe that the full business architecture concepts or components are within the strategy part, not from the EA perspective. Do you have any perspectives on this particular area?
Yeah, I think if you look at architecture work, there are, of course, many ways you can approach a specific project or program or an architecture issue or a challenge. And each of these different types of architecture work actually demand a tailored approach. So there are situations in which I believe it is a good idea to position business architecture as I think that it was intended, like from both perspectives that I just described, and use those parts from its perspective as you see fit, as will help you with the specific issue or challenge or program or project that you're doing. I don't think people should see business architecture as either one thing or the other thing, because that would limit the possibilities of leveraging business architecture as it was intended from the first place, as it was intended in the first place. I get where you're coming from, And I see that happen around me as well. But I think that people are looking at, in this case, business architecture, but it happens with other domains as well. They're looking at it from a very set perspective, very rigid perspective, that it doesn't allow for any movement. And they try to apply the context of business architecture from that unmovable perspective, which limits actually the possibilities of using it on a much broader scale. And I think if people are able to let go of that idea and look at it from alternate perspectives, they will really see the power that business architecture can bring to the table that we call enterprise architecture.
Now let's shift the wheel to one of the most important topics nowadays, where you know that data is everything today. So what about information architecture? What makes it unique, and how does it differ from or tie into even data governance and analytics?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. And let me try to answer this as best as I can. I think that information architecture often, how to put it, gets conflated with data architecture or governance or even analytics, but that it plays a unique role. So I think that information architecture is primarily concerned with the structure, the meaning, and the usability of information within an organization. So it has a strong focus on semantics and on context. I think that information architecture defines what information is important to the business and how it should be organized, independent of databases or technology. So it bridges business and data. It ensures that these information concepts that I referred to earlier, like strategy or customer or order, are defined consistently across the organization so everyone speaks the same language. And also it focuses on making this information findable and understandable and actually usable for decision making and for operations. So this makes information architecture, I think, even more human centric, unlike data architecture, which is storage and system oriented. Now, you did ask me how information architecture ties in with data governance, right? So I think data governance is about accountability, quality, control over data. And information architecture provides the blueprint for governance. So it's kind of like a map of what information means and where it flows. Whereas governance is the rules of how it's managed and who's responsible. And as for the relationship between information architecture and analytics, I think that analytics thrives on trusted, well-structured, and meaningful information. So for example, information architecture enables that by defining common dimensions and measures. So information means the same thing everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Eric, for this description. And in conclusion, I would say that information is a strategic asset that help or support the data strategy, in particular, data governance and operations from analytics perspectives and so on and so forth. So I believe this emphasizes the growing importance of information as a strategic asset within the enterprise architecture. Do you agree with this recap?
Yeah, I think you touched on a good point there. And yeah, I agree. So without repeating a lot of what I just said, I think you're on the right track here.
100%. Well, this will get us into the classic two domains, I would say, applications and technology. A lot of people have different perspectives on those two particular domains. So what's the practical difference between application architecture and technology architecture? I would like to start with this particular area, and then we can discuss where do they typically overlap together?
Yeah, so these two domains do indeed often get blurred because I think both deal with what we call IT architecture, but they actually play very different roles. So to keep it a bit brief, I think application architecture focuses on, let's say, the software landscape, how applications support business capabilities and interact with each other. It also has different concerns than technology architecture. So an application architecture concern could be what applications exist, how do they integrate, what are the functional boundaries, and of course also the audience differs. So for application architecture, the audience is business stakeholders to show which applications support their needs, IT planners, even solution architects. And technology architecture, on the other hand, focuses on the technical infrastructure and the platforms that host and enable these applications. So its key concerns are platforms like cloud services, middleware, operating systems, infrastructure, networks, storage, and even standards and technology stack choices, right? So the key focus of both domains is really different from one another. But also the audience of technology architecture is completely different than it is for application architecture. For technology architecture, it consists of infrastructure teams, platform engineers, DevOps, CIO, CTO for technology road mapping. And I think if you put it in an analogy, I think you could say that application is like the city zoning map. What buildings exist? What purpose do they serve? How do they connect using roads or bridges? And I think technology architecture is then the foundation and the utilities of the city. So power, plumbing, transport, construction materials. Application architecture is the what and how of software systems, supporting business needs, of course. And technology architecture is the where and on what those systems run.
I love this metaphor, Eric, and I believe that breaks down every domain. And in conclusion, each domain has a distinct job to do. But the importance of EA is in how they come together to drive the enterprise forward, not concentrate on a specific domain over others. The coherent system that you already mentioned before several times. Now that we have explored the traditional 4 domains, some organizations go even further. They add a 5th domain like security or customer experience, for example, or even they customize architecture layers depending on their needs and their current situations. In your book, Getting Started with Enterprise Architecture, you mentioned both the 4 domain and the 5 domain models. Can you walk us through what's the difference between them and why some organizations choose to go or to extend the standard model in this particular area?
Yes, let's quickly return to the classic domain model, right? It consists of these 3 domains: business architecture, information system architecture, and technology architecture. At least that is how it's applied in frameworks such as the Jager standard. And then the information systems architecture domain can then be divided into data and application architectures. Now, I've said at the beginning of this session that I prefer information architecture to data architecture because I believe that information is more meaningful than data. And earlier I gave the example of the numbers 21 to 25 being the temperature forecast for next week. And therefore, I see advantages of this 4-domain model consisting of business, information, application, and technology architecture. However, there are also models which include 5 domains. And one such model is often used in, for example, the healthcare industry. So this 5-domain model consists of the following domains: organization, processes, information, applications, and infrastructure, which refers to the technology architecture domain. And what we can see here on this slide is that the business architecture domain has been split into 2 parts: organization and processes. And the original data domain from the 3 or 4 domain model has been replaced by this information domain. Now, I think that if you further divide the main domains or the core architecture domains, this will create more clarity for each one. And I think that is what makes this model usable for example, the healthcare industry. And of course, it's true that the reference architecture for healthcare aligns very well with the concept of this 5-domain model. Now, it's also worth mentioning that some of the domains, and I think that is what you were referring to when you posed your question, do not form their actual own horizontal layer or horizontal domain, but they cut across all these horizontal layers. And these are referred to as cross-cutting domains or cross-cutting concerns.
Yeah, I got your point, Eric, but getting back to, for example, when they divided the business architecture into organization and processes, this means that they only use these components from the business architecture or these subdomains from the business architecture into the full metamodel or the full architecture domain. Like you split the technology from the security part. Usually security can be included from the technology layer, but you separate them or you divide them to provide more clarity to the organization, I would say. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's what I meant. So every domain, or sometimes it's even called layer, but I like to refer to it as domains. Every domain and the people responsible for performing actions within the context of that domain have their own specific part in relation to this cross-cutting domain. So if, for example, if we take security as an example, then you could say that the people responsible for the organizational layer or the organization domain in this 5-domain model would know exactly what to do within the context of security for the part they are responsible for. And that's what I meant by dividing these domains to create more clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And when do you think it is appropriate to add a 5th domain? Or in other words, how should that be decided to have a 5th domain or a 4th-domain approach?
If I'll refer back to the security domain, right? It's not a typical domain like business or application architecture. Like I said before, it cuts through all the other existing domains. And although given the importance of security within the context of an organization, it still cannot be seen as this separate domain. So here we can see the cross-cutting concerns, right? They are visualized using the vertical blocks in the slide that's appearing right now. So aside from the security architecture, you could also add governance or motivation, or another example is the topical issue of sustainability, which can also be looked at as a cross-cutting concern.
I think this helps a lot to understand when customization is useful. I believe it is based on the organization needs and I would say the full structure and the business direction that they are following. But the question is, how rigid should the organizations be when following or when it comes to the 4-domain or a 5-domain approach? Is it more important to adapt to the context, the bigger context, or the best practices when having 4 or 5 domains?
Yeah, I think the short answer is they shouldn't. They shouldn't be all that rigid. Because like all things architecture, this too should be tailored to the situation and the context of the organization. So the architecture domain models are simply meant to provide this starting point, the models that we just shown you throughout this session. Now, of course, it helps to divide an organization into manageable chunks, if you will. It's easier to assign responsibilities and everything, but it is not written in stone. The same goes, and I'll refer to the example that I gave before. The same goes for the security domain, right? Like I said, it's cross-cutting concern, but let's say you're an organization that provides technology-related or infrastructure-related security services, then I can totally imagine that you would see security as one of the more important architecture domains. So you could add it as a separate domain if you're likely to need a separate architectural lens to manage it. So you should elevate security or any other area to its own domain if it's not just technical, but if it impacts your brand, if it impacts compliance, if it impacts trust even. You should be mindful that adding a 5th domain should not be an arbitrary action like adding another box or something. The decision should really follow governance and some sort of value criteria, like is there a strategic driver for it? For example, regulatory compliance or an executive mandate. And you should also clearly articulate the scope of this domain. So to stay in the context of security architecture, what does it cover that isn't already handled elsewhere? That's important. You should take care to avoid duplication with existing domains. For example, think about, let's say, data security versus data modeling. A lot of data security requirements often already exist in the data modeling guidelines. And one other thing to ask yourself is who owns this domain? Is it the Chief Information Security Officer? Is it the Security Architecture Board? And how does it align with enterprise architecture governance? Because adding a new domain is only useful if its outputs feed into other domains, because otherwise you'll get silos. So all these existing domain models are meant to help you get started. They suggest an approach to use, but it's always best to tailor it to your own needs.
Yeah, 100%. And I would say it all brings us back to what is the business direction or the strategic context. And based on that, you start tailoring your approach. And this will prove that EA is not a one-size-fits-all. Again, it's about tailoring without losing the essentials.
Yeah, exactly. There are some guidelines that you can follow if you don't have any specifics that apply to your particular situation. But if you do have specifics or things that you need to consider, then you need to tailor the basic architecture framework and the way that it's set up, tailor it to your own organizational needs to make it the best fit possible. That's the general idea of architecture. And that goes for business architecture, information, data application, and technology architecture. For all the domains, this applies. So that's really important to remember, that tailoring a framework, tailoring the way that you implement architecture governance, actually the word tailoring is something that people need to remember.
That's a perfect way to wrap up this episode, Eric. I would say EA gives us models to work with, but ultimately the best architecture is the one that fits your organization needs, the organization reality, directions, and so on and so forth. So I believe now we have a solid understanding of the core domains, what each one of the domains bring to the table, and how to think about them as a coherent system, like you mentioned before. Eric, thanks a lot for walking us through that with so much clarity. Again, it's a pleasure to have you as our guide in this video series.
Yes, my pleasure, Omar. It's been, like I said before many times, it's been, again, fun to do.